I had always thought of myself as an ordinary child in an ordinary family. I wasn't spoiled, but I wasn't neglected either. Or at least, that was true before everything changed. The night my sister was born, my world shattered, and I didn't even realize it at the time. I was jolted awake by frantic knocking at my bedroom door, Aunt Clay's panicked voice calling my name. When I opened the door, her pale face was tight with worry. "Ivy, you need to pack your things. Your mom's in the hospital." Hospitals meant accidents, injuries, bad news, the kind of things children shouldn't have to think about. I imagined the worst, my heart pounding in my chest. But the real horror wasn't the emergency itself. It wasn't the uncertainty or the fear of losing my mother. No, the true nightmare was what happened afterward, when my little sister, Rachel, became the center of my parents' universe, and I became nothing more than an afterthought. Rachel was born 2 months premature. I didn't understand what that meant, but I knew it was serious because suddenly everything in our house revolved around her. Weeks blurred into each other as I stayed at Aunt Claw's house, overhearing hushed conversations about Rachel's fragile condition. My mother was rarely home, and when I saw her, she would just smile weakly and say, "Be good, Ivy. Mommy is very busy." And so, I learned to be invisible. When Rachel finally came home, it felt like we were living in a different house, one that no longer had space for me. Our home transformed into a sterile fortress, filled with the sharp scent of disinfectants, antibacterial wipes stacked on every surface, the air thick with the paranoia of contamination. My mother scrubbed her hands so much they cracked, monitored the temperature in Rachel's room like a scientist overseeing an experiment, and treated every visitor like a potential biohazard. But the worst part wasn't the obsessive cleaning or the endless rules. It was the way my existence seemed to shrink, as if I were nothing more than a potential risk to be managed. The slightest cough, the smallest sneeze, and I was exiled to Grandma's house, to Aunt Claw's, to anywhere that wasn't near Rachel. At first, I thought it was a treat. Grandma Amelia was warm and loving, always inviting me into the kitchen to bake with her. But as time passed, I realized the truth. I wasn't sent away because they cared about my well-being. I was sent away because they cared more about Rachel. I tried everything to win back my parents' attention. When I brought home my first straight-A report card, my mother barely glanced at it before returning to her list of Rachel's medications. When I won first place at the school science fair, my father sighed and told me to store my display board in the garage. Rachel might be allergic to the dust. And when I performed in the school talent show, pouring my heart into a piano piece I had practiced for months, my parents never showed up. Rachel had a fever that day, a mild, common fever, but that was enough to keep them home. 2 weeks later, when Rachel played a 5-minute flute recital, the entire family attended. They clapped like she was the next Mozart, praising her natural talent. That was the moment I knew. No matter what I did, I would always be second place in my own family. Rachel knew it too. She figured out early that she could manipulate any situation. A little fatigue? She got to skip school. A slight headache? She lounged on the couch all day while I was expected to handle my own responsibilities. If her homework was too difficult, my mother would call the teacher to complain. Meanwhile, I was left to navigate everything alone. I didn't hate Rachel, I just hated the way my entire world had been erased to make space for her. But I learned something important. If no one would cheer for me, I would applaud myself. If no one would help me succeed, I would carve my own path. And I had no idea then that quietly walking away from my family would be the best decision I ever made. The one person who saw me, the real me, was Grandma Amelia. Every time I was sent to her house, she welcomed me not as an inconvenience, but as someone who mattered. She pulled me into her world of antique jewelry, showing me shimmering rings, faded gemstone necklaces, small wooden boxes filled with history. One afternoon, she placed an antique hairpin in my hands and asked, "Do you know what this is, Ivy?" I shook my head. "This is a Victorian-era piece, handmade. See these engravings? No machine could create such details. And this mark here, she pointed at a tiny symbol near the clasp. That's the jeweler's hallmark. Things like this are worth more than you might think. I turned the item over in my fingers, feeling the cool metal, the weight of something old yet valuable. That was the moment I realized some things had worth that wasn't immediately obvious. And the more time I spent with Grandma, the more I learned. How to distinguish real gold by its weight, how to recognize a natural pearl with just a glance, how the way a gemstone reflected light could reveal its rarity. I was fascinated, but at home, none of it mattered. I was expected to fade into the background while Rachel basked in constant praise. When she got a C+ on a test, my parents threw a small celebration for her hard work. When I scored the highest in my class, it was barely acknowledged. That was when I understood. I couldn't wait for recognition. I had to claim it myself. So I threw myself into academics, not just for love of learning, but because I knew it was my ticket out. I joined every club I could: the debate team, student council, the school newspaper. I worked part-time at a cafe, saving every penny. When it came time for the SATs, I didn't just score high. I got a perfect 1600, an achievement less than 1% of students reach. I stared at my computer screen in shock. I had done it. I had something undeniable, something that should have made my parents proud. "Mom, I got a perfect SAT score," I told her, beaming. She barely looked up. "That's nice, Ivy, but I'm busy helping Rachel with her homework. Can you go clean up the house?" Rachel smirked from across the room. "Wow, someone thinks she's special." That was the moment I realized that no matter how far I went, in their eyes, I would always be nothing compared to Rachel. So I stopped trying to impress them. I filled out my own scholarship applications, handled my college paperwork, figured out everything on my own. I earned a full-ride scholarship to the University of Michigan. Tuition, housing, books, all covered. At dinner, when I shared the news, my mother sighed. "Michigan? That's so far away. Rachel's gonna miss you." Rachel grinned. "Great. When you leave, I'm taking your room. I need more space for my TikTok videos." On move-in day, no one in my family came to see me off. Aunt Clee drove me instead, handing me an envelope from Grandma Amelia. "She wanted you to have this," she said softly. Inside was a letter and a small stack of money, my grandma's pension savings, a gift of silent encouragement. I hugged Aunt Claw, my throat too tight to speak. I made a promise to myself that day. I would never come back empty-handed. College was my escape, my fresh start, my proof that I was more than just an afterthought in my own family. The moment I stepped onto the University of Michigan campus, I felt something I had never experienced before: possibility. No one knew me as Rachel's sister. No one looked at me like I was invisible. Here I could finally exist on my own terms. I threw myself into my studies with the same relentless determination that had carried me through childhood. I took on double majors in business and art history, a combination that raised a few eyebrows but made perfect sense to me. Art history taught me the language of aesthetics, the significance of craftsmanship, the ability to recognize value beyond the surface. Business gave me the tools to turn that knowledge into something tangible, something profitable. I had no idea at the time how perfectly those two fields would align for the life I was about to build. I worked harder than anyone around me, not just because I was ambitious, but because I had to be. Unlike many of my classmates, I had no safety net, no one to fall back on if things didn't work out. Every opportunity had to be earned, every success a stepping stone toward the life I envisioned for myself. I took on internships that barely paid, worked weekend shifts at a local auction house, and spent every free moment buried in research. My fascination with antique jewelry only deepened as I handled real pieces: necklaces from the Art Nouveau period, rings with delicate filigree work from the Edwardian era, brooches that had survived centuries. I learned to recognize the subtle markers of authenticity, the hidden hallmarks that separated true heirlooms from clever forgeries. More than anything, I learned to trust my instincts. While my classmates spent their summers traveling or relaxing, I took a position at a prestigious auction house in Chicago. The job was grueling. I spent hours cataloging what seemed like junk: tarnished rings, scratched watches, faded lockets that no one cared about. But I paid attention. I studied every engraving, every setting, every imperfection. Then, one day, I found something, a brooch that had been dismissed as a cheap replica. Something about it felt off. It had weight, history, a certain craftsmanship that didn't match its supposed worth. I stayed late, cross-referencing records, comparing its design to documented collections. 2 days later, I confirmed my suspicion. The brooch wasn't worthless. It was an authentic Art Deco piece from the 1920s, crafted by a renowned jeweler whose works were highly sought after. I brought my findings to the auction director. He barely glanced at me. "You're sure?" he asked, skeptical. "Absolutely." I laid out my research, my sources, my comparison charts. The brooch, initially priced at a few $100s, was reevaluated. When it went to auction, it sold for $58,000. For the first time, someone in a position of power looked at me with something other than indifference. I was no longer just another intern. I was the girl who had found a fortune in what everyone else had overlooked. My role at the auction house changed after that. I was assigned higher value pieces, given access to exclusive collections, trusted with clients who expected expertise. But as much as I loved the work, I began to realize something. No matter how valuable the jewelry I authenticated, no matter how much profit I brought in, I was only ever getting a fraction of the reward. The auction house made millions. I made a modest salary. I wasn't satisfied with that. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to settle for anything less than complete control over my future. So I made a decision. I withdrew every cent of my savings, took out a small loan, and rented a tiny office space in Chicago. It was on the second floor of an old building above a Chinese restaurant. The scent of food clung to the walls. The Wi-Fi was unreliable, and every time someone ordered Kung Pao chicken downstairs, the whole office filled with the smell of chili peppers. But it was mine. My first headquarters consisted of a folding table, a chair I'd found abandoned on the street, which I, of course, sanitized thoroughly, and a desk lamp from a thrift store. Every morning I made coffee from a battered old machine and sat at that table as if I were running a multi-million-dollar company. Because one day I would be. I started small, taking contracts from local antique dealers, offering my expertise at rates lower than the big firms but with quality they couldn't match. Word spread. Clients came to me with heirlooms they thought were worthless, only to discover they had treasures. I had a knack for finding what others missed, a diamond ring assumed to be fake, but actually a rare cut from the early 1900s, a tarnished locket that once belonged to European nobility. My reputation grew, and within months, I was making more money than I ever had before. Then came my first real turning point. A private collector approached me with a family heirloom collection for authentication. I worked tirelessly, examining every stone, every engraving. 2 of the pieces had been misidentified as fakes. They weren't. When the collection went to auction, it sold for over $900,000. My cut? 10%, $90,000, more money than I had ever seen in my life. I sat in my tiny office, the check in my hands, ink smudged on my fingers from my research notes, and I cried. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I knew I was on the right path. With that money, I upgraded. I moved into a real office with functioning air conditioning, a small showroom for clients, and a proper team. I hired my first employee, Jenny, a recent gemology graduate with the same hunger I had once felt. Over the next 2 years, my company expanded. I opened a second location in New York, then Miami. High-profile collectors sought me out, major auction houses partnered with me. I had built something undeniable. And my family? They still had no idea. Every time I went home for dinner, I played the role of ordinary Ivy, the girl with a small job at an antique shop. My mother would glance at me disinterestedly. "You're still at the same place?" "Yeah, still the same," I'd reply, smiling. Rachel would roll her eyes. "God, you should really get a real job." She had no idea that just that morning I had closed a $500,000 authentication deal. Then one day, everything changed. Aunt Claw called me, her voice tight with worry. "Ivy, your parents are in financial trouble. They might lose the house." For a moment, I felt nothing. Then, something bitter surfaced. After years of being ignored, dismissed, treated like an afterthought, they were finally reaching out because they needed something. But as much as I wanted to be indifferent, I couldn't ignore it completely. That house, for all its painful memories, was still the place I had grown up. So I started sending money, $7,000 a month, anonymously, enough to keep them afloat, but not enough to raise suspicions. Then, one night at dinner, my mother beamed at Rachel and said, "Rachel, you are such a wonderful daughter. Thanks to you, we didn't have to sell the house." I nearly dropped my glass. Rachel shrugged, feigning humility. "Yeah, I just wanted to help." I let out a quiet, bitter laugh. She was taking credit for my money. That was when I realized no matter what I did, I would never be enough in their eyes. But this time, it didn't hurt, because I had built something that they knew nothing about. And then came the night that changed everything. Thanksgiving. The night my secret was exposed. The night my family discovered the truth, and their desperation turned into greed. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a time for gratitude, a moment where families put aside their differences to share a meal and reflect on what they had. But deep down, I had always known that my family was different. Gratitude had never been a currency in our home, only expectations, obligations, and the unspoken rule that Rachel was the sun around which we all had to orbit. I had spent years perfecting the art of blending into the background, making myself small enough to avoid their endless demands, while still pretending to be part of their world. But this year was different. My mother had called me 2 weeks before the dinner, her voice carefully laced with exhaustion. She spoke of how cooking for the family had become a burden, how her back ached from years of standing in the kitchen, how she just didn't know if she had it in her this time. It was a masterful performance, one I had seen before, designed not to ask for help directly, but to push me toward volunteering. And of course, I did. Refusing would have only given them another reason to paint me as ungrateful, the selfish daughter who had abandoned her family in pursuit of her own selfish ambitions. So I handled it. I hired one of the most exclusive catering companies in Chicago, the same one that serviced my corporate events, ensuring the meal would be nothing short of spectacular. The menu was impeccable. Truffle-stuffed turkey, rosemary-infused mashed potatoes, a selection of handcrafted desserts that would have put any five-star restaurant to shame. The cost? More than 2 months of Rachel's salary, but it wasn't about the money. I had long since stopped worrying about price tags. No, this was about control, about making sure that for once, there would be nothing they could criticize, nothing they could use as ammunition against me. But of course, that was wishful thinking. The moment the food was served, Rachel wrinkled her nose, her expression twisted in disdain. "You ordered takeout?" she scoffed, as if I had personally insulted her. "Jesus, Ivy, at least make a proper stuffing." My grip tightened around my wine glass, my nails pressing into my palm as I forced myself to stay silent. This was coming from the same person who once managed to burn instant ramen in the microwave. My mother, ever the peacemaker, quickly interjected, her voice placating. "It's a little different from past years, but at least we have a meal to enjoy." I said nothing. I had learned long ago that in this family, logic had no place. The evening dragged on, filled with forced conversation and the familiar feeling of suffocation. Rachel talked endlessly about her so-called demanding marketing job, conveniently leaving out the fact that her responsibilities mostly involved fetching coffee and making minor edits to PowerPoint slides. My mother nodded along, enraptured by every mundane detail as if Rachel were unveiling the secrets of the universe. And me? I simply smiled, knowing that just that morning I had closed a $500,000 jewelry authentication deal. After dinner, I retreated upstairs to my childhood bedroom, seeking a moment of quiet. An auction was happening in Hong Kong. An Art Nouveau necklace was up for bidding, and one of my VIP clients needed confirmation on its authenticity before placing an offer. I opened my laptop, scanning the financial reports and market trends, completely absorbed in my work. I didn't hear the door open, didn't register the presence behind me until it was too late. "Do you have a phone charger?" Rachel's voice was casual, but her eyes had already locked onto my laptop screen. Before I could react, she lunged forward, snatching the device from my hands with a triumphant grin. "Let's see what you're—" She froze. Her smirk vanished, her face drained of color. There, in plain sight, was my bank account balance. Over $12 million. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a heavy, suffocating stillness that stretched between us. Then Rachel's expression twisted into something ugly. Something desperate. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Whose money is this? Don't tell me you actually have this much." I shot to my feet, reaching for the laptop, but she was already moving, bolting out of the room, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Everyone, come look, Ivy's a millionaire." The moment I stepped into the dining room, I knew there was no turning back. My entire family sat in stunned silence, their eyes locked on Rachel as she waved my laptop like a smoking gun. "She has over $12 million, she announced, her voice laced with hysteria. $12 million, and she let us struggle. Mom, Dad, she's been hiding this from us." My mother's fork clattered against her plate. Her face went pale, then red, her hands trembling as she turned toward me. You had that kind of money while your father and I have been struggling to pay the mortgage," she asked, her voice tight with barely contained fury. "While Rachel has student loan debt? While we've been scraping by to keep this house?" I stood still, my expression unreadable. There was no pride in their eyes, no acknowledgement of my achievements, only anger, only greed. My father slowly rose to his feet, his jaw tight. "We raised you," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You have an obligation to this family." Rachel, sensing the perfect moment to strike, plastered on a look of wounded betrayal. "I just need $2 million, she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. "That's not much to you, right? I just want a fresh start, a better life, like you." My mother nodded, seizing the opportunity. "That's right, Ivy. And your father and I have been thinking about a vacation home in Florida. Nothing extravagant, just $3 million. You wouldn't even notice the money was gone." I let out a slow breath, something cold settling in my chest. "So now I have a financial responsibility to this family?" My father's expression darkened. "It's not a matter of thinking, daughter. It's your duty." I set my wine glass down carefully, looking at each of them in turn. "I've been sending $7,000 a month into your account for the past 2 years, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I helped pay off this family's biggest debts." A heavy silence fell over the room. My mother's eyes widened. "What did you just say?" I exhaled a laugh, bitter and sharp. "Oh, but Rachel already took credit for that, didn't she?" I glanced at my sister, watching the way her smug expression flickered with panic. My father clenched his fists, his face unreadable. Slowly, I rose to my feet, gathering my laptop and my designer handbag, the same one my mother once assumed was a cheap knockoff. I walked toward the door, pausing only once. "Not another cent," I said, my voice steady. "No more support. This family is no longer my responsibility." My mother's face crumpled. Rachel gaped at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But I didn't care anymore. I walked out the front door and never looked back. The calls started immediately. My phone vibrated nonstop. My mother, my father, Rachel, even distant relatives who had never spoken to me before. The messages poured in. How could you do this to your family? I raised you. Let's be reasonable and talk like adults. You have all that money. Why are you being so selfish? I blocked them all. For the first time in my life, I was free, and I never looked back.